In this lecture, we're going to talk about plant taxonomy and major plant groups. What we're really going to cover is how people have grouped things over time. This is actually a really old thing that people have been doing. Um, if you think about it, you go outside and things are not just random. Yeah, so some plants and some animals will look more alike than others. So naturally, people started grouping things, and with the development of science, we created a whole system on sorting and classifying plants and also all kinds of organisms. But the interesting thing here is that this will help us when we go in the field ID some plants. But to begin, we're going to talk about the domains of life, and this is how scientists classify life in general. And then we're also going to talk about major plant groups, and they're listed here. We're going to talk about all of them. Okay, so how do we group things? Lately, people came up with this new system of classification. They're no longer called kingdoms, they're called domains. And the domains are divided into two main groups, prokaryotes and eukaryotes. So, in terms of prokaryotes, their cells are a little different from eukaryotes, meaning that their cell nucleus is not completely developed. So things are just swimming around the cell. On the other hand, eukaryotes have much more developed cell and things are more organized. So if you look at prokaryotes, there's archaea and bacteria. So those organisms are much older, especially archaea. And then when we talk about eukaryotes, we have protista, plantae, fungi, and animalia. So you can tell right now just by looking at these groups that you have animals and you have things like mushrooms in one group, and then you have plants. We will focus on plants today, but I want you to make sure that you know that fungi, mushrooms are not in the plant kingdom. The other thing is, what makes a plant a plant? How did people divide them up into these groups? Well, plants can make their own food, they can photosynthesize. Some other organisms not in the plant group can also do the same, but plants are also not mobile. Those are the main characteristics. And they do have plant cells, they're different from animal cells and cells from fungi. Okay, fungi and animals cannot make their own food. So this is important to notice because this is how things are organized. Talking about plants, we have major plant groups, and all plants evolved from green algae, mosses. And you can see here that mosses split up to the left, and you see them grow in rocks. They also grow on trees. And then later on, this tree split again, and you have ferns or seedless vascular plants. So ferns or fern allies, and we'll talk about them later. And then later on, it kind of split up between gymnosperms and angiosperms. So gymnosperms here are just cone-bearing plants. So they have no flowers. And then you have gymnosperms, which are flowering plants. So most of the plants we deal with on the everyday basis are normally flowering plants. And they're really important because we eat a lot of them. But I'll give you an example later on of some ferns that are also edible. Okay, so why don't we cover bryophytes now, or mosses? So mosses are really cool. You see them growing just all over the place in wet areas. So they definitely need a very wet environment because mosses, they don't have true roots or true vascular system. So they have to grow kind of close to the ground or close to a structure where they're getting supported by. But then if you take a closer look at mosses, you can see that this is the reproductive part right here, and it's called a sporophyte. And inside this structure, these structures actually produce spores. So these plants do not flower. They don't have the capacity to flower, and they produce spores instead. So you can see here how close to this rock they're growing, and it's really because they really don't have roots, or they don't have stems that can support them upright. So no vascular tissues here. So if you look at this, here's another way to represent all the different information I'm presenting here. So you have mosses, you have ferns, and you have gymnosperms and angiosperms, right? So I was just telling you that in mosses there's no support tissues or vascular tissues. We'll go into more detail when we cover vascular tissues later, but they really don't have that support system. They also don't have true leaves, believe it or not. The leaves that you see there are very, very, like the very beginning of, you know, leaf formation in the evolutionary scheme. They don't have stems, they don't have roots, they don't have pollen, they don't have seeds or fruits. So, and they require water to get fertilized. So that when they're reproducing, they kind of need that water surface. And I'll tell you later how these plants, angiosperms and gymnosperms, they don't need water anymore in that case. And you can see here, no water required, because they evolved to kind of bypass this water need, which is really cool. Ferns, on the other hand, they also need water to reproduce, but when you think about support tissues, they are present now in ferns. Same thing with true leaves or stems, but ferns don't have true roots. So they have a different way to support themselves, but right now they don't have true roots, they don't have pollen, they don't have seed, and they don't have flowers or fruits. So let's look at ferns now. So ferns are really cool. They're all shapes and forms of ferns. They can actually be quite tall, like the hapu'u fern here in Hawaii. I'll show you a picture in a bit. So here you can see, if you turn a fern leaf around, like turn it so you can see these little dots here, you can see that they are actually sporangia, or they're areas where spores are being formed. So when a fern reproduces and goes through its life cycle, it needs the spores to actually be produced here, and then the spores fall on the ground, and then they'll continue their life cycle. So this is really easy to see. If you've ever seen a fern leaf and you see the little dots underneath the leaf, that's what they are. They're spore producing structures. So looking at ferns at Volcanoes National Park, they're amazing in Hawaii. The ferns here are really, really incredible. They can get quite tall, and they're really, really important part of the forest life. So just really gorgeous to go hiking at Volcanoes National Park and see them. And the fern diversity in Hawaii is amazing. So there are tons of different species, and they're quite interesting. But now I'm going to talk to you about a different fern. This is an introduced fern that a lot of people here eat. So it's not native to Hawaii. It got introduced here in the 1900s. And people harvest the very, very top of the leaf. So before the leaf uncurls and opens up, there are these little structures here, and you can pluck them off. And a lot of people think it tastes like asparagus. I really like it. It's really cool to eat a salad, really delicious with these fern tips. So if you ever have a chance to eat them, go for it. Okay, so coming back to this picture again, ferns have those supporting tissues. Yes, they do, but look, they don't have fruits and flowers, and they still require water to get fertilized. So I'm not going to go into detail about the fern life cycle. You can take Botany 101 to, if you were interested in that. It's very in-depth information, but yeah, other classes will cover this. But I want you to be able to ID ferns when you see them outside in the garden. So it's important to know that no, they do not produce flowers or fruits, and yes, they do require water to get fertilized. Okay, now we're gonna move on to gymnosperms, or cone-bearing plants. Gymnosperms have tons of supporting tissues, and I'm going to show you why in a little bit. So they do have true leaves, they have stems, roots, pollen, they have seeds, but they're in a cone, and they do not have fruits or flowers. And right now, at this point, they don't require water for fertilization. So something incredible happened here, that now you actually have a seed. So the evolution of the seed happened right here with gymnosperms. You can see that ferns or nor mosses have seeds. So it happened here, but there's no fruits. So fruits are absent. And I'll show you a picture in a little bit. So gymnosperms. So when I was talking about all those supporting tissues, those plants can get really, really tall. So the giant sequoia from like California, or the coast redwood, those are the tallest trees in the planet, and they're all conifers, so they're cone bearing plants. And you can see here, compared to a house, how tall these plants can get. So the one of the reasons that these plants have cones is now to hold the seeds, but the seeds are quite naked, and I'll show you in a little bit what they look like. So here's a cone, and then if you look carefully, you can see that there is a seed attached right here. So the seeds are just laying on the very surface of the cone. They're not protected by a fruit. They're just laying there. And some cones are very specialized. They're closed for years until fire goes through a forest, and then the cones open up and the seeds are able to germinate. But the important thing here is that you're gonna see some conifers, some gymnosperms here in Hawaii, but they're all not native. We don't have any conifers in Hawaii that are native. A lot of them have been introduced to Hawaii for timber, and you can see them in different areas. You can see them on Oahu all over the place. I use some of them as Christmas trees, but they were not native. Okay, so coming back here to this figure, you can see that yes, gymnosperms have tons of supporting tissues, and that's how those trees can grow so tall. They do have true leaves, and sometimes those leaves are shaped like a needle, and they stay green even when it snows in where those plants are native to. They can really stay green all year round. They have stems, roots, and they produce pollen. They do have seeds, but they don't have fruits or flowers. So now I want to compare this to angiosperms, right? This is flowering plants. This is the first time ever flowers are actually produced. So if you think about flowers, why would a plant spend so much energy into producing these flowers? Think about it for a second. They're very colorful. They are happening in all kinds of shapes and forms, and it just seems kind of crazy for a plant to start producing these flowers. But the reason why flowers evolved is because these plants wanted to get pollinated, and they kind of co-evolved with insects. And gymnosperms, on the other hand, they just produce tons of pollen, and the pollen floats in the wind. That's how pines reproduce. They produce pollen, pollen floats in the wind, and the wind carries that pollen to a different female cone, and that cone then gets fertilized, and seeds are produced. But in angiosperms have a very precise form of reproduction. They produce flowers, therefore they don't need wind pollination anymore. They now have insects, and insects are quite precise. They'll visit a flower of a certain species, they'll gather the pollen, and then they'll visit another flower in a different plant of the same species, and then they fertilize that flower. And this is an amazing thing if you think about evolution, because at this point, the angiosperms are kind of saying, hey, I really need some genetic diversity. I need my pollen to go really far and fertilize another plant. And then this way, by having super attractive, colorful flowers, you get to attract insects to do that job for you. And it's just not insects anymore. So it started with insects, but now there's bird pollination, there's even lizard pollination. There's some weird forms of pollination out there. And this is what flowering plants do best. So another interesting thing about flowering plants, so if we compare angiosperms or flowering plants to gymnosperms, and gymnosperms being cone-bearing plants, we can see here that for the first time in the evolutionary scheme, fruits are formed. And fruits are an amazing, amazing structure because one, they enclose the seeds, so they protect the seeds. And when you compare this to a cone, the seed is quite vulnerable on that cone. They're just sitting right there and they don't have anything around them. So the fruit, on the other hand, is protecting that seed. It's making a really nice home for that seed. But also, the fruit kind of it's amazing because then that fruit may get dispersed by an animal because it's super tasty, right? So, for example, where apples are from, bears would pick up the apples and then eat them and poop them out like far away, poop out the seeds far away and then disperse those seeds really far away. So apples are native to Kazakhstan, and you can still see today wild apple forests. And then people know, scientists have studied this, and they know that bears are the major dispersers. So this happens with all kinds of plants. So it's a very smart thing to have like a sweet thing covering your seeds, enclosing your seeds, but also offering something to an animal to disperse. Not all seeds are, not all fruits are like this. Some fruits are dry, and we'll talk about this later in the semester. But there's definitely something going on here with having those seeds enclosed. It's very important. And angiosperms have done extremely well because you can even you can tell this by just going outside and looking around, and you're gonna see mostly angiosperms or flowering plants. You're not gonna see a lot of gymnosperms. So they're doing quite well for sure. Okay, so I was talking about angiosperms, right, or flowering plants. So in this case, flowering plants are divided into two different groups. And I want to cover them now because when you start IDing plants or going outside and looking at plants, one thing that you're going to ask yourself is, oh, is this a fern? Is this an angiosperm or flowering plant? Is this gymnosperm or a conifer? And then you're going to get to a point that you're like, okay, this is not a fern. This is not a cone-bearing plant. It's not a gymnosperm. Oh, yes, this has flowers and fruits. Therefore, it's an angiosperm. Okay, so when you get to that point that you're like, okay, this is an angiosperm, it's definitely a flowering plant, then the question that is going to follow is this a monocot or a dicot? Monocots and dicots are just two major groups of flowering plants. I'm gonna go over the major characteristics here, and I think it's quite straightforward. So right now I'm not gonna cover vascular bundles. We'll see this under the microscope later on in the semester. But I want to focus on the big parts of monocots and dicots that you can see right away when you go and you walk outside. The first thing you're gonna see, if you get to see seeds, you will know that a seed that only has one cotyledon is a monocot. And some examples of these are grasses, but also corn. So if you ever see a corn kernel, you will know that when that corn kernel germinates, it doesn't split up like a bean. So beans are different because when you plant them, they have two cotyledons, so they're dicots, and those cotyledons kind of split up, and you have two little leaves emerging. So that's a clue, and I'll cover this more later. But the big thing here is flowers. Flowers, leaves, and roots. If you know these three things, you can identify monocots versus dicots. So let's look at flowers. Dicot flowers are multiples of 4 or 5. So if you count the petals, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, you know, oh, dicot right away. So monocots have multiples of 3s. So if you count here, 1, 2, 3, only 3 petals, so you're good to go. But you will learn all about this in lab. So another way to identify monocots versus dicots is by looking at the leaves. So if you look at monocot leaves, they have parallel veins. So if you think about a grass blade or a grass leaf, it's long, it's skinny, and it has those parallel leaves. You know right away grasses are monocots. Same thing with corn, same thing with sugarcane. If you thinking about dicots, on the other hand, they have really broad leaves. So the venation is definitely not parallel. They're kind of like branching. So you know right away, like hibiscus have this kind of leaf, right? So that's definitely a dicot. But when you look at roots, on the other hand, monocots have super fibrous roots. They don't have tap roots. And dicots have just really long tap roots. Okay, so a quick quiz here. Is this plant a monocot or a dicot? So I'll give you a minute to count the petals. And by now you should see that it's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 petals. Therefore, we have a dicot here. So take a look at this flower right here. So how about this one? You have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 petals. So multiples of 3 monocots. So this is a lily.